What happens when Hollywood's most famously gruff leading man sits across from television's most persistent interrogator? You won't believe what unfolds when Harrison Ford faces off against George Stephanopoulos in what was supposed to be a simple promotional appearance that turned into an absolute disaster. The tension was palpable from the moment Ford walked onto the Good Morning America set, and by the end of this explosive encounter, America would witness one of the most shocking celebrity meltdowns in live television history. This is the story of how a legendary actor's patience finally snapped, leaving viewers stunned and a seasoned host scrambling to salvage what remained of his reputation. The morning started like any other at the Good Morning America studios in Times Square. Harrison Ford had arrived to promote his latest project, expecting the usual softball questions about his career and upcoming film. The 81-year-old actor, known for his no-nonsense attitude and dry sense of humor, settled into the familiar guest chair across from George Stephanopoulos. What neither the production team nor the viewing audience anticipated was that Stephanopoulos had prepared an entirely different agenda for this encounter. "Harrison, thank you for joining us this morning," Stephanopoulos began with his trademark polished smile, his hands clasped professionally on the desk. "I know you're here to talk about your new film, but I'd like to start with something that's been making headlines recently." Ford's expression immediately shifted, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'm here to talk about the movie, George. That's what we agreed on." But Stephanopoulos pressed forward, his journalistic instincts overriding any consideration for his guest's preferences. "Your comments last month about the current political climate have generated quite a bit of controversy. Some critics are saying you've become too outspoken for someone in your position. How do you respond to that?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Ford's famous scowl deepened as he leaned back in his chair, clearly caught off guard by the aggressive opening. The veteran actor had dealt with difficult interviewers before, but there was something particularly calculated about Stephanopoulos' approach that set him on edge immediately. "My position?" Ford's voice carried a dangerous edge that anyone familiar with his filmography would recognize. "What exactly is my position, George? I'm an actor who happens to have opinions about the world I live in. Last I checked, that was still allowed in this country." Stephanopoulos, sensing blood in the water, leaned forward with the predatory instinct that had made him a formidable political journalist. "But don't you think celebrities have a responsibility to stay out of political discourse? Your recent statements about environmental policy and government accountability have drawn criticism from both sides of the aisle." The studio audience, initially excited to see the legendary Han Solo in person, began to sense the growing tension. Camera operators adjusted their angles, capturing every micro-expression on Ford's increasingly agitated face. The actor's legendary temper, usually kept in check during professional appearances, was beginning to show cracks in its facade. "Responsibility?" Ford repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You want to talk about responsibility? How about the responsibility of journalists to ask honest questions instead of trying to create controversy where none exists?" The accusation hit Stephanopoulos like a slap across the face, but he maintained his professional composure while internally calculating his next move. This was exactly the kind of confrontation that could make for compelling television, and he wasn't about to back down now. "I'm simply asking you to clarify your position on issues that matter to Americans," Stephanopoulos replied smoothly, his tone remaining deceptively calm. "Your comments about climate change and corporate responsibility have been quite pointed. Some would say you're using your platform to push a specific political agenda." Ford's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles whitening with tension. The man who had portrayed some of cinema's most iconic heroes was struggling to maintain his composure in the face of what he clearly viewed as a deliberate ambush. "This is exactly what's wrong with media today," Ford shot back, his famous rasp becoming more pronounced with anger. "Everything has to be labeled, categorized, turned into some kind of political weapon. I care about the planet my grandchildren will inherit. If that's political, then so be it." The exchange was rapidly spiraling beyond the boundaries of typical morning television fare. Stephanopoulos, rather than recognizing the warning signs and pulling back, seemed energized by Ford's growing agitation. The host's eyes gleamed with the intensity of a prosecutor closing in on a key witness. But your recent association with certain environmental groups has raised questions about your true motivations, Stephanopoulos continued relentlessly. Critics suggest you're being used as a mouthpiece for radical environmentalist positions that could harm American workers and industries. That accusation proved to be the final straw for Ford's patience. The actor's face flushed red with indignation as he leaned forward in his chair, his famous intensity now fully focused on his interrogator. Radical? Ford's voice carried the same menacing quality that had made Darth Vader tremble in the original Star Wars trilogy. Caring about clean air and water is radical now? Wanting to leave a habitable planet for future generations makes me some kind of extremist? The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras and lighting equipment. Even the usually chattering production crew had stopped their activities to watch the unfolding drama. Stephanopoulos, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far too fast, attempted to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "I'm not suggesting that, Harrison. I'm simply trying to understand." "No, you're not trying to understand anything," Ford interrupted, his voice cutting through Stephanopoulos' attempt at damage control like a lightsaber through steel. "You came into this with an agenda, and you're trying to bait me into saying something you can turn into a soundbite for your evening news segment." The accusation hung in the air between them, and for the first time since the interview began, Stephanopoulos appeared genuinely uncomfortable. His usual smooth demeanor cracked slightly as he realized his guest had seen through his strategy and called him out on live television. But rather than backing down or changing course, Stephanopoulos made the fatal decision to double down on his aggressive approach, setting the stage for an even more explosive confrontation that would leave viewers across America speechless and questioning everything they thought they knew about their morning news programming. "Harrison, I think you're being overly defensive about legitimate questions," Stephanopoulos said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that immediately triggered Ford's legendary temper. "The American people have a right to know where their entertainment figures stand on important issues, especially when those figures are using their celebrity status to influence public opinion." The condescending delivery was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Ford's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits, and anyone who had worked with him on film sets over the decades would have recognized the warning signs of an impending explosion. "Overly defensive," Ford repeated slowly, each word dripping with barely contained rage. "You ambush me with political gotcha questions when I came here to talk about a movie, and I'm being defensive? What kind of journalist are you, George?" Stephanopoulos, perhaps drunk on his own perceived power, or simply too arrogant to recognize the severity of his miscalculation, leaned back in his chair with an infuriating smirk. "I'm the kind of journalist who asks the hard questions that matter to Americans. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you should reconsider putting yourself in the public eye." The insult hit Ford like a physical blow. Here was a man who had been in the entertainment industry for over 5 decades, who had weathered countless interviews and press conferences, being lectured about public scrutiny by someone he clearly viewed as a opportunistic hack. "Handle scrutiny?" Ford's voice rose to a level that made everyone in the studio uncomfortable. "I've been handling scrutiny since before you were out of diapers, kid. But there's a difference between legitimate journalism and what you're doing here, which is nothing more than tabloid ambush tactics dressed up as morning television." The "kid" comment was a deliberate provocation, and Stephanopoulos' face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. At 62 years old, he wasn't accustomed to being dismissed so casually, especially not on his own show in front of millions of viewers. "I'm not sure personal attacks are helping your case here, Harrison," Stephanopoulos replied, his professional mask slipping to reveal the wounded ego beneath. "If anything, your reaction is proving my point about celebrities who can't handle legitimate questions about their public statements." Ford laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor that sent chills through the studio audience. "Personal attacks? You mean like suggesting I'm some kind of radical extremist for caring about the environment? Or implying that I'm too stupid to have my own opinions without being manipulated by activist groups?" The exchange had devolved into something far beyond typical morning show fare. Viewers across the country were witnessing what appeared to be a complete breakdown of professional courtesy, with both men now openly hostile toward each other. "I never called you stupid," Stephanopoulos protested, but his tone suggested he was considering it. "No, you just heavily implied it," Ford shot back. "That's your specialty, isn't it? The implication, the suggestion, the carefully crafted insinuation that lets you attack someone while maintaining plausible deniability." The accusation struck home with surgical precision. Stephanopoulos had built his career on exactly that kind of calculated journalism, and having it called out so bluntly on live television was clearly rattling him. "I think you're projecting your own insecurities onto this conversation," Stephanopoulos replied, his voice growing colder and more clinical. "Perhaps the real issue here is that you're uncomfortable with the fact that your political opinions aren't as popular as you thought they were." It was a low blow designed to undermine Ford's confidence and public standing, and the veteran actor recognized it immediately. His face went through a series of expressions that would have been fascinating to watch if the circumstances weren't so volatile. "My insecurities?" Ford's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouting. "Let me tell you something about insecurity, George. An insecure person is someone who has to tear down others to make themselves feel important. Someone who uses their platform to humiliate guests instead of conducting honest interviews." The personal nature of the attack clearly stung Stephanopoulos, who was now fully engaged in what had become a verbal warfare rather than any semblance of professional journalism. The pretense of conducting an interview had been completely abandoned. "I'm not here to coddle celebrities who want softball questions," Stephanopoulos snapped back. "If you can't defend your positions under pressure, maybe you shouldn't be taking those positions publicly." Ford stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the studio floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. The physical gesture sent a clear message that the interview was rapidly approaching its breaking point. "Defend my positions?" Ford towered over the seated host, his imposing presence filling the camera frame. "The position that we should take care of our planet? The position that corporations should be held accountable for environmental damage? Those positions need defending in your world?" Stephanopoulos, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far but unable to back down without losing face, made the catastrophic decision to continue his attack. When those positions come from someone with no expertise in environmental science or economic policy, yes, they need defending. The insult about Ford's lack of expertise was the final nail in the coffin of what had once been a professional relationship. Ford's face went through a transformation that was both fascinating and terrifying to witness, settling into an expression of pure contempt. "No expertise?" Ford's voice carried the kind of quiet intensity that had made his performances legendary. "I've been flying planes for 40 years. I've seen firsthand what's happening to our forests, our coastlines, our wildlife. But according to you, that doesn't count because I don't have a degree in environmental science?" The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented in morning television history. Even the production crew had stopped their usual bustling activity to focus entirely on the unfolding drama. Stephanopoulos, cornered and growing desperate, played what he thought was his trump card. "Flying planes actually makes you part of the problem, doesn't it? All that carbon emission while you lecture the rest of us about environmental responsibility, isn't that a bit hypocritical?" The accusation of hypocrisy was designed to be the killing blow, but instead it served as the catalyst for Ford's complete loss of patience with the entire charade that this interview had become. Ford's reaction was immediate and volcanic. His face transformed into something that would have made even the most hardened Hollywood executives take a step back. The legendary actor, who had faced down fictional villains and real-life studio executives with equal composure, finally reached his absolute breaking point. "Hypocritical?" Ford's voice erupted with such force that several audience members visibly flinched. "You want to talk about hypocrisy? Let's talk about a so-called journalist who pretends to care about informing the public while he's really just trying to create viral moments for his own career advancement." Stephanopoulos opened his mouth to respond, but Ford was far from finished. The dam had burst, and decades of frustration with manipulative media tactics came pouring out in a torrent of righteous anger. I fly planes because I love aviation. And yes, I'm aware of the environmental impact. That's exactly why I support cleaner technologies and responsible policies. But you don't want to hear about that, do you, George? You just want your gotcha moment, your little soundbite that you can play on repeat for the next week. The host, now clearly rattled by the intensity of Ford's response, attempted to regain control of the rapidly disintegrating situation. Harrison, I think we should. No. Ford's interruption was so forceful that it seemed to shake the entire studio. You've had your chance to talk, now it's my turn. You brought me here under false pretenses, ambushed me with political questions I never agreed to discuss, and then had the audacity to lecture me about my qualifications and my character. Well, let me tell you something about character, George. Ford leaned down toward Stephanopoulos, bringing his face uncomfortably close to the now sweating host. The camera captured every detail of the encounter, from Ford's blazing eyes to Stephanopoulos' obvious discomfort. Character is treating your guests with respect. Character is asking honest questions instead of setting up gotcha traps. Character is being a journalist instead of a carnival barker looking for the next freak show attraction. Each word hit Stephanopoulos like a physical blow. The man who had built his reputation on cornering politicians and celebrities found himself completely outmatched by an actor who had finally decided to fight back with both barrels blazing. I don't have to sit here and be insulted by someone who clearly has no understanding of legitimate journalism, Stephanopoulos stammered, his professional composure completely shattered. Ford straightened up and let out another one of those bitter laughs that had been sending chills through the studio all morning. Legitimate journalism? Is that what you call this circus? You're not a journalist, George. You're a provocateur with a morning show time slot and an inflated sense of your own importance. The insult hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Stephanopoulos' face went through several shades of red as he struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't make him look even worse than he already did. I've been a respected journalist for decades, he protested weakly, his voice lacking any of its earlier confidence. Respected by whom? Ford shot back without missing a beat. By the people whose careers you've tried to destroy for ratings? By the politicians you've ambushed with gotcha questions? Or just by yourself and the other media vultures who think destruction is entertainment? The brutality of Ford's assessment was devastating in its accuracy. Everyone in the studio could see that Stephanopoulos had been completely dismantled by an actor who had simply refused to play by the rigged rules of modern television journalism. You know what the real problem is here, George? Ford continued, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. You've forgotten that there are actual human beings on the other side of your cameras, people with feelings, with dignity, with the right to be treated with basic respect. But that doesn't matter to you, does it? All that matters is the ratings, the clicks, the viral moments that make you feel important. Stephanopoulos made one final, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his reputation. I'm just doing my job, Harrison. Asking the questions that Americans want answered. The response triggered Ford's most withering attack yet. Americans want answered? Or Americans want to see you humiliate someone on live television? Because there's a difference. And if you can't see that difference, then you have no business calling yourself a journalist. Ford began removing his microphone with deliberate, theatrical precision, each movement designed to emphasize his complete contempt for the entire proceedings. The gesture sent a clear message that the interview was over, whether Stephanopoulos liked it or not. You came here looking for a victim, George, someone you could push around and embarrass for your own entertainment. Well, congratulations, you found the wrong guy. Stephanopoulos, perhaps sensing this was his last chance to maintain any semblance of control, made the fatal mistake of trying to have the last word. Running away won't change the fact that you couldn't handle a few tough questions. Ford stopped dead in his tracks, the microphone dangling from his hand like a weapon. He turned back toward Stephanopoulos with an expression that could have melted steel, and when he spoke, his voice carried the accumulated power of every iconic character he had ever portrayed. Tough questions? Ford's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than all his previous shouting. You think those were tough questions? Let me ask you a tough question, George. When you go home tonight and look at yourself in the mirror, are you going to be proud of what you did here today? Are you going to be able to tell yourself that you conducted yourself with integrity and professionalism? The question hit Stephanopoulos like a physical blow, and for the first time in the entire encounter, he had no response. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. Ford nodded with grim satisfaction at the host's stunned silence. That's what I thought. When you can answer that question honestly, maybe then you'll understand what real journalism looks like. With that devastating final assessment, Ford turned his back on Stephanopoulos and walked toward the exit with the dignity and presence that had made him a Hollywood legend. His footsteps echoed through the stunned silence of the studio as cameras followed his every move. "This interview is over," Ford announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying clearly through the studio's sound system. And, frankly, it should never have started. As Ford reached the edge of the set, he paused for one final moment and looked back at the defeated figure of George Stephanopoulos, still sitting stunned in his host chair. The contrast between the two men was stark. One standing tall with his integrity intact, the other slumped in defeat with his reputation in tatters. "Good luck explaining this to your producers, George," Ford said with cold finality. "You're going to need it." And with that, Harrison Ford walked off the Good Morning America set, leaving behind a studio full of shocked crew members, a devastated host, and millions of viewers who had just witnessed one of the most spectacular implosions in morning television history. The man who had brought Han Solo and Indiana Jones to life had just delivered a real-life performance that would be remembered long after his fictional heroics were forgotten. In standing up to a bully with a microphone, Ford had reminded everyone watching what real strength and dignity looked like, and what happened when someone finally refused to be pushed around by the manufactured outrage machine of modern media.